Here's your wrestling news for April 24th, 2021. And if you like what you're watching, smash that like button and give us 1,000 likes or more. And your headlines for today include: WWE fires vice president from company. Charlotte Flair strongly opposed his firing. WWE might bring Carrano back because he knows where too many bodies are buried. WWE takes back recently released high-level executive. Aleister Black returns to SmackDown with a twisted new vision. Mickie James addresses her trash bag tweet causing Carrano's WWE firing. Mickie James responds to Stephanie McMahon's apology. Former World Heavyweight Champion takes a dig at Mickie James' explanation of trash bag tweet. Ex-WWE Diva says she blamed the wrong person for sending belongings back in trash bags. What's next for Cesaro and Bryan after tonight's SmackDown? Pro wrestlers drag journalist over comments about Charlotte Flair's complete makeover. WWE preparing for transition into mainstream entertainment property like Marvel and DC Comics, and more. We're kicking off with WWE, as the company recently released many names from their corporate side recently, and they've not stopped yet. PW Insider is reporting that Mead Rust has been fired as WWE's Vice President of Communications, a role he was in for 2 years after 16 years with A&E. It was previously reported that referee John Cone will no longer work in talent relations, though will stay with WWE as a ref, whilst Director of Talent Relations Nicole Zioli has departed after 11 years with the company. We'll have to see if anyone else goes from corporate, as April seems to be the month of major releases for both the superstars and the office staff. Joe Villa, who was with WWE for 16 years and served as manager of publicity and corporate communications for 8, has also gone, and he'll be missed by many people in the company. In a tweet, Villa said he was humbled and overwhelmed by the support he's received from superstars, colleagues, press, and friends, adding that it was an honor to work with WWE. In her own tweet, Charlotte Flair called Villa as an unsung hero of WWE and thanked him for helping her deal with the media. WWE is shaking things up because Vince McMahon reportedly wants new blood in management as part of plans to propel WWE into a bigger entertainment property, and Joe Villa wasn't part of those plans. One person many superstars are pleased to see go is Carrano, who was responsible for the personal items of released talent being sent in trash bags. When Fightful asked around, many superstars commented on his release, saying, Carrano, with others referring to him as a snake who couldn't be trusted at face value. There are some who believe he could be brought back though because, quote, he knows where too many bodies are buried. Carrano's firing came when he was revealed as the one who approved former wrestlers' belongings being sent in trash bags, which started a dialogue about how the company treats former superstars. It was also speculated that Carrano may have been used as a scapegoat in this situation, and that plenty of superstars may still be mad at the office he represented, which is now overseen by John Laurinaitis. Carrano's role in WWE had been, quote, neutered since WWE brought back Laurinaitis, but now all power Carrano once had in the company is a distant memory. We mentioned earlier how John Cone was removed from his role in talent relations, but that dismissal didn't last long. PW Insider reports that Cone is once again a senior manager of talent relations, serving under Laurinaitis. Unlike Carrano, Cone had supporters, as Mick Foley pulled for WWE to bring Cone back in talent relations. Cone will still serve as a referee in WWE, but now he'll be back to his busy schedule, juggling 2 important roles in the company. One person surprisingly still with WWE is Aleister Black, as after a half a year on the sidelines, Black returned to SmackDown via a promo on last night's show. Appearing with glasses and berating the viewers, he's still a heel, and we say still because it's easy to forget that he turned heel last year before his departure. Black's return was a welcome sight as he channeled elements from Tales of the Crypt and Far Cry whilst still resembling a black metal musician. What we do know is that Black is being repackaged as a storyteller, and the following weeks should be very interesting indeed. On Twitter, the Dutchman shared a cryptic tweet saying he will take fans by the hand as they dance through the abyss, and we're interested to see where the storyteller will lead us. It's crazy to see how the former NXT champion was completely mishandled in the latter stages of 2020, and we can't exactly blame fans who thought that he would be one of the names released last week, especially as he hadn't been showing up to SmackDown in weeks. Fortunately, that isn't the case, and Black is back and better than ever, and we can only hope that he's used as well now as he was in NXT. What do you think of this new character for Aleister Black? Let us know in the comments. One thing we weren't so keen on from SmackDown was Big E blindsiding Apollo Crews backstage, as it's not exactly the move of a babyface. Yes, Big E does have a genuine beef with Crews and Commander Aziz, but the charismatic face Big E would surely use a promo rather than a sneak attack. Even Big E's interaction with Kevin Owens earlier in the night was out of character, and we're wondering what WWE has planned for the former Intercontinental Champion. Last week, Mickie James was released from WWE, and though her second run with WWE didn't match her first in titles, she did force WWE to change how they treat released talent. On Twitter, James addressed the controversial situation, saying it'd be the last time she'd address it before moving on, adding that she takes no joy that somebody has lost their job. Saying she considered Carrano a friend, James adds that she's sure that Vince McMahon had no idea how the belongings of superstars were being sent, and knows that this wasn't a deliberate attack on her. Though she's sorry that this thoughtless and tone-deaf action cost someone their job, she's not sorry that she made a stand, and has ensured it never happens again. Closing her statement, Mickie reiterated that she's grateful to WWE for her career, and is looking forward to everything that comes next. James started her statement saying, "To whom it may concern," a trope that the Iron Sheik clearly doesn't like, as 4 minutes later he tweeted, "Whoever says to whom it may concern, please go f*** yourself forever, you dumb son of a bitch." In a separate tweet, James addressed Stephanie McMahon's apology, saying she knows the trash bag wasn't a malicious act, but it feels very symbolic as to how she was presented in the last 3 years. James has made it clear that she has no desire to retire from the ring, and we'll have to see what's next for the former women's champion when her 90-day non-compete clause ends in July. Mickie's statement started a conversation, as the trash bag practice has been going on for a very long time. On Twitter, Jillian Hall said that when she received her personal items in the trash a decade ago, she blamed the wrong person, and now that person isn't with WWE anymore. The Wrestling Observer newsletter is also reporting that this practice has been going on for more than a decade, meaning it was happening before Hall was ever given the pink slip. The former Divas champion certainly hinted that blaming this person was at least part of the reason why they're not with WWE anymore, as Hall might need to make a phone call soon to give a long overdue apology. More from SmackDown now, as right now the plan seems to be Roman Reigns vs. Cesaro as the main event of WrestleMania Backlash. With all his momentum, this is the right match for Cesaro, and on SmackDown, the Swiss Superman teamed with Daniel Bryan to defeat Jey Uso and Seth Rollins. Bryan's 2021 losses to Cesaro and Shinsuke Nakamura have made it clear that he's taking a step back from the main event, and last night, Bryan was actively pushing for Cesaro to get a Universal Championship shot. Roman Reigns is less sold on Cesaro, as he brushed the Swiss superstar aside to offer Bryan a title shot next week, but told the Yes Movement leader that he should leave SmackDown when he loses. This isn't exactly a loser leaves SmackDown match, but it's likely WWE's way of writing Bryan off for a few months, and given that his current contract reportedly expires this September, it could mean that he's officially transitioning to a part-time superstar role after next week's SmackDown. Forcing the beloved Bryan to leave would only add to Reigns' heat, though focusing on Bryan did mean that Cesaro didn't look as good, given that the Tribal Chief brushed him off so easily. Many fans are hopeful that Daniel Bryan will extend his contract, but recent reports are suggesting that the former WWE champion is looking to add specific terms to his new deal. Fightful reports that he's trying to find a way in which he can wrestle for WWE as well as other promotions, and Bryan has confirmed that he wants to take a step back to spend more time with his family. Do you think this title match is WWE's way of granting his wish? Share your thoughts in the comments. Earlier this week, Charlotte Flair called out Dave Meltzer after he reported that she'll be getting a complete makeover during her suspension, a claim that the WWE superstar denied. Not only did Flair deny that her time away is for anything more than a dental procedure, but she also called out Meltzer for not calling her to check the facts, as well as claiming that she was deeply self-conscious over her body. Telling Meltzer, "Go to hell," Flair's comments has sparked a reaction from other wrestlers, who are backing up the Queen. Sonya Deville said that people like him take comfort in insulting people they wish they could be, whilst AEW's Shawn Spears used some not-so-PG language in his response. Impact's Moose said that Flair looks like a goddess, whilst Meltzer looks like a full vacuum cleaner bag, and we doubt Meltzer's comments have done him any favors with the wrestling community. And we're ending today with WWE President Nick Khan, who has big plans for the company to expand its reach into the mainstream. According to PW Insider, Vince McMahon is giving Khan plenty of freedom backstage. As they reported, "We are told by a number of WWE sources that Khan has been given great power and leeway by Vince McMahon to move WWE forward into the future and prepare to bring the company towards a more mainstream entertainment property." It's also reported that Khan envisions WWE as similar to Marvel and DC, with lots of crossover appeal, both for performers and the WWE brand itself. Do you think WWE will succeed in becoming an even bigger part of the entertainment world? Let us know in the comments. Well guys, that's our news for today. Please share your comments below. Also hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon to receive all notifications. And as always, thanks for watching.